New York's Attorney General wants to change state law so police would only be authorized to use force when absolutely necessary. Democrat Letitia James is calling for new legislation to raise the legal standard for when officers can use physical or deadly force. The change would also bring new criminal penalties against police who use unnecessary force. Here's how Attorney General James explained the plan last week.
The centerpiece of this effort is to amend the use of force law from one of simple necessity to one of absolute last resort. And under the current law, police officers are legally justified in using deadly force, not only to defend themselves or others, but also when they reasonably believe that an individual has committed a particular crime. If there is a way to accomplish the officer's objective short of lethal force, we should absolutely demand that they take that other path.
Dennis Kenney joins me now. He's a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice and a former police officer. Professor Kenney, welcome. Great to have you with us. What impact do you see this legislation having if it passes, if it ends up being enacted?
Well, I've only seen a summary of the legislation, so I can't refer specifically to what they've actually proposed. I've seen the press release of it. I understand the goal that they're attempting to reach, and certainly think that it's a good one and needs to be addressed. But I'm afraid that there's enough ambiguity, at least in what I've seen, that they're unlikely to accomplish what either the public wants or what the police will find acceptable.
Well, to your point, the head of New York City's largest police union criticized this proposal, I suppose not surprisingly, saying it, quote, would make it impossible for police officers to determine whether or not we are permitted to use force in a given situation. So as a former police officer yourself, do you believe that police officers have a vested interest in minimizing ways that they can be punished or held responsible for behavior that ends up inadvertently harming suspects?
Well, I can well imagine that police, particularly the union representation, would prefer to reduce exposure as much as possible. I don't know that that's a particularly meaningful goal from a public standpoint. However, the goal of reducing the use of deadly force is a good one, though it doesn't really establish, at least what I've seen, doesn't really establish a standard of what constitutes appropriate use of force. And I think that the weakness in what I've seen does that, or does that is the weakness. There's not a clear statement of what the goal is to be. I would argue that the goal should be to limit deadly force to those cases where it's necessary to protect human life. It doesn't really clarify what constitutes deadly force. Does that include chokeholds and hog tying, or is it just gunplay? It doesn't provide any guidance to officers on how to establish how much risk is required. And it doesn't do anything to clarify our responsibility. We understand that the police have to make difficult decisions under difficult circumstances, but we don't really address the responsibility that we have to prepare them for those decisions. Training that they would support them, the mid-range use of force options that should be available to them, those kinds of things. It doesn't address any of that.
So ultimately, then, what is the kind of measure that you believe would be useful in this situation? You pointed out that there is something admirable in the sort of spirit of this legislation, even if the letter of it so far from what you've seen looks too vague to be useful or effective, as you pointed out. Since you're the perfect person to sort of comment on what kind of legislation might be useful with your professional background as an actual police officer and your academic background having studied, police force, what sort of legislation would be useful here? Obviously, there has been a fracturing recently in public trust in police officers. That doesn't help anyone. That doesn't help the police force. That doesn't help our communities. So what sort of legislation do you think would be useful?
Well, there should be a clear statement of when deadly force is appropriate, when it is, and if it's not, if those circumstances aren't met, then it's not. the standard should be one of protecting human life. And as I said, what they should be doing is defining then both what is deadly force and how much risk to life is required before that level of force is appropriate. But it also comes up short, I think, in a couple of other areas. Probably the area that I like the most in it is the third provision that addresses the question of officer conduct in contributing to the need for force. We've been looking at that for quite some time. Miami-Dade police were studying that back in the 1970s, where they were looking at uses of force that were ruled to be appropriate, but we're interested in going back to see the events that led up to it, what they could have done differently to avoid force. And I'd like to see much more focus on that sort of thing. For example, officers don't have a lot of guidance when they're in the process of attempting to make an arrest. If an individual is resisting, it doesn't clarify the officer's options or even requirements to simply disengage. We call off police pursuits when the need to apprehend is the risk to the public outweighs the need to apprehend. Can we do the same thing with arrests, and should we? It should be clarified to officers when just stepping back is the best option.
All excellent points. I wish these would get more discussion, sort of clarity around officer conduct and maybe greater training and de-escalation methods, clarity as to whether it is appropriate to not continue the chase or not continue the arrest effort, where those lines are drawn, and more clarity around, when deadly force is appropriate. All of those sound like great suggestions. Hopefully, some public officials will look into it a little bit more. Professor Dennis Kenney, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate your insight.
Thank you for having me.